This is the lecture for Persons, Compensation, and Utilitarianism by Diane Jeske, or Jeske, I'm not sure how to say her last name. So we finally made it to the sort of explicitly ethical part of the class. So the class title is Personal Identity and Ethics, but we haven't really talked a lot about ethics yet. So congratulations, we've made it. And we're going to talk about ethics in this lecture in the second and third bullet point. But before that, one more personal identity only point, and this is reductionism about personal identity. So you'll recall from the Parfit lecture, the last point I made, no, the second to last point I made and the third to last point about Parfit is sort of like a psychological theorist and also a no-self theorist. He's a psychological theorist sometimes, but he says stuff that sound like no-self theories. And the label that we give to like the Parfit place, one label we can give to it is something that I think Parfit may have called it in that article, but if not, Jeske calls it this in this article. She calls it reductionism about personal identity. So what is reductionism about personal identity? Well, the thought is that a reductionist about personal identity says that personal identity isn't some sort of special thing on its own, some sort of special feature on its own that we care about. Rather, what we care about is something else that makes up personal identity, sometimes perhaps, and sometimes doesn't make up personal identity. So if you think about Parfit, the way I described it in that lecture was relation R is the label that Parfit uses for this in the stuff we didn't read. But in the stuff we did read, Parfit says, it looks like what matters is psychological continuity and connectedness. And so that's what makes up personal identity when it makes up personal identity. Sometimes it doesn't make up personal identity, like in a split brain case, you have psychological continuity and connectedness, but not personal identity. And what do you care about in the split brain case? Well, you don't care about personal identity, you care about psychological continuity and connectedness. So that's what Parfit suggests we should care about. And so we call him a reductionist because he sort of reduces personal identity down to psychological continuity and connectedness and stuff. And then he says we should care about that stuff, not personal identity. So reductionism about personal identity is kind of like two views put together. One, it's the thought that personal identity isn't some like special thing, but rather it's made up of something else. And second, that something else does not matter. Or sorry, personal identity does not matter. That something else is what matters. So psychological continuity, connectedness, relation R is what matters, not personal identity. Parfit is definitely a reductionist about personal identity. He straight up says personal identity does not matter. This other thing matters. It's a little complicated because the first part of reductionism that says personal identity is not like a special separate thing. It's made up of other stuff. I mean, if you think about it hard enough, like everybody thinks personal identity is, well, not everybody. Most people think personal identity is made up of other stuff. So like the animalist thinks personal identity is made up of being the same animal, or the body theorist says it's made up of the same body, or the narrative theorist says personal identity is a matter of narrative or whatever. So like the important part of reductionism is the thing that says like personal identity doesn't matter. Like this other thing matters in a way that personal identity doesn't, such that we can have this other thing and lose personal identity and still be fine. So that's sort of what's special about reductionism. This might be going by sort of fast and it's confusing. If it is, that's fine. It's not a big. This is mostly just to give you a word to identify Parfit, reductionism, and to help you understand what reductionism means. Jeske talks about reductionism in this article, and so she'll help you understand it. And also, it's good to understand reductionism before you before you read her, because this will help you understand what is she doing with reductionism in this article. Okay, personal identity stuff done. Now putting on our ethics hat and talking about ethics. So first, very simple point, we want to know what utilitarianism is because that'll be very important to this article. She tells us, very first sentence, according to utilitarianism, we ought to maximize benefits and minimize burdens. So that's utilitarianism. And just to give you a bit more detail, if you haven't taken an ethics course or something, or if you haven't enrolled in an ethics course before and never heard of utilitarianism in detail. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory. It tells us what is good and bad and right and wrong. And specifically, it's two things. It's a theory of the good, and then it's a theory of what to do about the good. So utilitarianism says utility is good and disutility is bad. That's straightforward. Uh, and, well, no, it's not. Sorry, that's not straightforward. What am I talking about? What is utility? Utility here is the easiest way to think about it is pleasure, and then disutility is pain. So that's the sort of hedonistic utilitarians is the label we give them. So pleasure is good, pain is bad. There are other versions of utilitarianism. The sort of the other most popular one is preference utilitarianism that says it's good when preferences are satisfied. So if you want to eat some samosas, it's good when you eat samosas. If you want to be rich and famous, it's good when you're rich and famous. If you want to have a good night's sleep, it's good to have a good night's sleep. And then bad is preferences going unsatisfied. So it's bad if you want your sickness to be cured, but your sickness is not cured. It's bad if you want to relax, but you don't get to relax and so on. So that those are different theories of utilitarianism, but they all count as utilitarianism because they say sort of whatever counts as good, we're going to call that utility. Whatever counts as bad, we're going to call that disutility. So I think the simplest way to think about it is just pleasure and pain. It doesn't really matter, but that's the easiest version of utilitarianism to have in mind. So it's a theory about what is good and bad. Good is utility and bad is disutility. And then it's a theory about what to do about what's good and bad. And as Jeske points out, it says we should maximize the good, or she puts it benefits, and minimize burdens, minimize the bad. So if you're a pleasure and pain utilitarian, you should maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So do whatever is going to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The way to think about it is sort of you want the biggest net pleasure. So if you're deciding what to do this morning, well, here's one option. You could hit yourself in the hand with a hammer. Here's another option. You could watch TV. Here's a third option. You could devote your life to helping people who are less fortunate than you. And how should you decide what you should do? Well, you add up all the pleasure that's going to result from the choice, the different choices, and then you subtract all the pain, and then whatever has the highest net pleasure, you do that. So hitting yourself in the hammer, probably going to be the lowest option. TV is probably going to be in the middle option. Devoting yourself to people less fortunate from you is probably going to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And the utilitarian says that's how you decide everything. So for every moral question, the right thing to do is to maximize net pleasure or maximize net preference satisfaction. So pretty simple ethical theory. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all to say. We could spend the whole semester just studying utilitarianism and not run out of stuff, but that's all you need to know about utilitarianism. One interesting feature of utilitarianism is that, as she will talk about in depth in the article, it does not respect what we call the separateness of persons. You'll figure that out in the article, but just to give you a bit of a primer on it, so you have the necessary background to understand what she's saying. So we can think about the how we treat intrapersonal trade-offs and how we treat interpersonal trade-offs, and notice that we tend to think about them in different ways. So what is an intrapersonal trade-off? An intrapersonal trade-off is a trade-off that sort of exists entirely within a single person. So what would that be? Well, there are thousands of examples of these. We face these all the time. For example, you can study now for a test, which will give you a fair amount of pain, a fair amount of displeasure, a fair amount of negative preference satisfaction. It's not going to be fun. So you can study for a test for, let's say, an hour. And that's an intrapersonal trade-off. Why? Because you go down right now, but eventually you score high on the test, and then you get a good grade in the class and your life goes well or something. And so you sort of go up later. So you're trading off negative right now for positive in the future. or when you save money in the bank instead of spending it on something that you want. That's an intrapersonal trade-off because you're trading off, you have minus pleasure right now because your money isn't helping you. It's just sitting in the bank. But you do better off later when you need some money. You have it saved. So that's a trade-off, bad now, better later. You can also do trade-offs in the other direction. So if you eat 6 pieces of cake right now, that's very good right now, but it's going to be very bad later. So you're trading off now against later in the other direction. You're taking a big benefit now in exchange for a burden later. So those are trade-offs interpersonal, and we do those all the time. And is it okay to do interpersonal trade-offs? Well, of course. What could be wrong with that? Nobody says, oh no, you shouldn't save money right now because that's bad for you. Because we respond, well, yeah, it's bad for me right now, but it's going to be better for me in the future. So what's the big deal? It's a trade-off. And it's fine to do it in the other direction too. Like if somebody says, oh, you shouldn't eat that cake right now because you'll feel bad in the future. If you're not going to feel very bad, it's just going to be a little tiny amount of bad, and it's very good to eat the cake right now. You'll say, no, of course I should eat the cake. It's a trade-off that I'm willing to make. I'm willing to feel a little bad tomorrow to feel very good today. That's a perfectly fine trade-off. So interpersonal trade-offs, they totally make sense. Nothing weird about those. Think about interpersonal trade-offs now, another kind of trade-off we can make. These are trade-offs between different people, so not contained within, but rather separate. So imagine I can eat the cake and this will make you feel bad tomorrow instead of me. I mean, that's of course a weird, well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I eat your cake. Yeah, here we go. I eat your cake. And so this is good for me and bad for you. It's a trade-off. It's an interpersonal trade-off. I do well, you do badly. Or let's say I can steal your money. This is a trade-off. Good for me, bad for you. And similar. So, there are interpersonal trade-offs all the time too. And we do these things all the time. So I use bad examples where I'm stealing stuff, but there are good examples too. So you have 2 children, and one of them wants to live on the coast, and the other wants to live by the mountains. But they're 5 years old or whatever, so they can't go live in separate places. They all have to live with you. So you have to make a trade-off. You have to live near the coast or near the mountains, or maybe you compromise or something, whatever. So that's an interpersonal trade-off between your 2 children. So we make these all the time too. But we don't at least typically make the same kind of trade-offs between people that we make within ourselves. So it's totally okay for me to eat the cake for the sake of doing worse tomorrow. It would be weirder if I ate the cake and made you worse off. Like that doesn't seem okay. Like that's not fair to you. It's fine in the intrapersonal case. It's fine if I eat the cake if I'm willing to sort of take the trade-off because I end up worse off. Like that's perfectly fine. It's like it seems unethical or something for me to eat the cake if you're going to be the one who suffers from it, or at least it's not obviously ethical. So it's less clear how to do maybe the interpersonal trade-offs. Those are more difficult to figure out than the intrapersonal. Now, if you said, hold on, I think it's easy to figure out how to do the trade-offs in both cases, just look at utilitarianism, then congratulations, you've realized something interesting about utilitarianism. It makes it very easy to figure out these trade-offs. But people think that's bad. Why is that bad? Well, read the article, you'll find out. But this is all just to sort of prepare you for this talk about trade-offs and separateness of persons and stuff like that. Why did I put separateness of persons up there on top? You'll see it in the article, but basically notice the fact that people are separate makes the trade-off interpersonal rather than intrapersonal. If it's just the same person, if there's no separateness of it's just one person, then it's one kind of trade-off. If it's separate people, it's another kind of trade-off.